Once upon a time, in the great kingdom of Oboduku, there lived a young woman named Obianuju. She was poor, but she was not lazy. She worked hard every day, not for herself, but for her sick mother, who lay weak in their small mud house, waiting for food that was never enough. When she heard that the palace was looking for new maids, she did not think twice. She tied her only good wrapper, walked straight to the palace gates, and begged for a chance. That was how she became a maid in King Odogu's palace. But life inside the palace was not easy. The older maids did not like her. They laughed at her rough hands, her worn clothes, and the way she worked too hard, as if the palace belonged to her. Look at her, Adane, the head maid, would say, scrubbing floors like her life depends on it. It did. Obianuju did not answer them. Talking back would not heal her mother or put food in her stomach. So she worked. She cleaned. She fetched water. She cooked, and she did not complain. One evening, she was given a special task to clean the king's chambers. It was an honor, but also a test. If she did well, maybe she would be noticed. Maybe she would get better work. She entered the king's room quietly. The walls were high, the bed covered in white clothes, and the air smelled of fresh palm oil and herbs. She moved quickly, dusting the shelves and wiping the tables. But as she reached for a high corner, her foot slipped. A stool tipped over. A clay cup crashed to the floor. Her heart stopped. Before she could pick it up, she heard heavy footsteps. Someone was coming. Quickly, she grabbed the broken pieces and hid them inside her wrapper. Just as she straightened up, the door opened. King Odogu stood there. Obianuju's knees felt weak. She had never been this close to him before. He was tall, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Who sent you here? The king asked. Her mouth felt dry. I was told to clean, my king. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then, to her shock, he smiled. You work hard, he said. That is good. Obianuju bowed her head, her heart beating fast. She had expected anger, maybe punishment, not praise. Then, as she turned to leave, she noticed something. A door inside the king's chamber. It was slightly open, just a little, but enough for her to see inside. And inside, something was glowing. That night, Obianuju could not sleep. She lay on the tin mat in the maid's quarters, staring at the ceiling. The king's secret door, the strange glowing light, what was inside? She turned on her side, squeezing her eyes shut. It was not her business. She was a maid, a poor girl from the village. If she got caught, she would lose everything. But the thought would not leave her mind. 2 nights later, she got her answer. She had finished her work late and was walking past the king's chambers when she heard it. A sound, a strange, low sound, like a whisper. She stopped. The sound was coming from inside the forbidden room. Slowly, she moved closer. The whispering stopped. Then, light, a golden light, soft but strong, spilled through the small opening of the door. Her hands felt cold. What was this? Why was it hidden? She leaned forward, just a little, and peeped inside. A staff, a golden staff, standing tall in the center of the room, glowing like fire in the dark. Obianuju's heart pounded. Before she could think, a voice spoke behind her. "What are you doing here?" She turned, her body stiff with fear. Dike, the king's right-hand man, stood behind her, his face like stone. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight. Dike stepped closer. His voice was low, sharp like a knife. "You should not be here." Obianuju felt a chill in her bones. She had seen something she was not supposed to see, and now she was in danger. Obianuju's legs felt weak. Her heart beat fast. Dike's face was dark with anger. His eyes burned like fire. "You should not be here," he said again, his voice low and firm. Obianuju opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dike stepped closer. "Listen to me," he said. "Go back to your work and never speak of this to anyone." Obianuju nodded quickly. She turned and ran as fast as she could, her feet light on the cold palace floor. When she reached the maid's quarters, she sat on her small mat, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking. She had seen something she was not supposed to see. What was that golden staff? Why was it locked in that secret room? That night, she could not sleep. She turned from side to side, her mind full of questions. Would Dike tell the king? Would they throw her out of the palace? Or worse, would they punish her? Morning came too fast. She waited, expecting someone to call her for punishment, but nobody did. Instead, something even more surprising happened. A guard entered the maid's quarters and stopped in front of her. "The king wants to see you," he said. Obianuju's heart jumped. Why did the king want to see her? Obianuju followed the guard through the long palace halls. Her hands felt cold and her feet felt heavy. When they reached the king's chambers, the guard stepped aside. "Go in," he said. She took a deep breath and entered. King Odogu was sitting on a high wooden chair, dressed in a rich red robe. His gold crown sat on his head, shining under the morning light. Obianuju bent her knees and greeted him. "My king." The king looked at her carefully, his deep eyes studying her face. "Do you like working here?" he asked. Obianuju's heart pounded. Why was he asking her this? "Yes, my king," she said softly. The king nodded. "I have been watching you, Obianuju. You are different from the others. You work hard and you don't gossip like the rest. I need someone like you." Obianuju frowned, confused. "Someone like me for what, my king?" The king leaned forward, resting his hands on the arm of his chair. "Would you like to be my personal assistant?" Obianuju's eyes widened. Personal assistant? That meant she would no longer work with the other maids. She would stay in the inner chambers, close to the king. Why was he choosing her? She felt the weight of the other maid stares burning into her back. They were jealous. She could feel it. Adane, the head maid, was standing at the corner. Her arms were crossed and her face was tight with anger. Obianuju knew one thing. This was not just about hard work. The king had a reason for choosing her. But what was it? And what was this offer, a blessing or a trap? Obianuju's new position brought her enemies. The other maids no longer laughed at her. Now, they whispered behind her back. They watched her with jealous eyes, their faces full of anger. None of them hated her more than Adanne. Adanne had worked in the palace for years. She believed she was the most important maid, the one the king should have chosen. But instead, the king picked Obianoju, the poor village girl with nothing. That night, as Obianoju was washing plates in the kitchen, she felt a shadow behind her. She turned. Adanne was standing there, her arms crossed, her face hard like stone. Obianoju wiped her wet hands on her wrapper. "Do you need something?" she asked. Adanne took a slow step closer. "Do you think you are special?" she hissed. "Do you think because the king chose you, you are better than us?" Obianoju felt her heart beat faster, but she did not show fear. "I am only doing my job," she said. Adanne's eyes narrowed. "Stay in your place," she whispered, "or you will regret it." Obianoju held her breath as Adanne walked away. Her hands were cold. She knew Adanne was serious, and she knew something else. She had made a powerful enemy. The days passed, and Obianoju tried to ignore the burning stares of the other maids. She focused on her work, waking up early and sleeping late. One evening, she was carrying a tray of food to the king's chambers. The smell of roasted meat and fresh soup filled the air as she walked through the quiet hallway. Then she heard a voice. "Be careful, my daughter." She froze. A tall man stood in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. He wore a long red wrapper, and a deep scar ran across his face. Obianoju gripped the tray tighter. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low. The man looked around, his eyes sharp, as if he was checking if someone was watching. Then he leaned closer. "Not everyone in this palace is who they seem," he whispered. Obianoju's body felt cold. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes darkened. "The king is in danger, and soon you will be too." Obianoju's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? Who wants to harm the king?" The man took a step back. "Watch your back," he said. "Trust no one." Before she could ask more, he disappeared into the shadows. Obianoju stood there, her hands shaking. Her heart was heavy with fear. What had she gotten herself into? And who was coming for the king? Obianoju's hands shook as she poured palm wine into the king's cup. Her mind was not at rest. The stranger's words kept repeating in her head. "The king is in danger, and soon you will be too." Should she tell the king? Would he believe her? She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, the door opened. Dike entered. He shut the door behind him and locked it. Obianoju's heart jumped. The king looked up. "Dike, what is it?" "My king," Dike said with a small bow, "I need to speak with Obianoju alone." The king glanced at her, then nodded. "Make it quick," he said before stepping into the inner room. Now, it was just her and Dike. The room felt smaller. Dike took a slow step towards her. His eyes were sharp, his face unreadable. "I know what you saw that night," he said. Obianoju's throat felt dry. She said nothing. Dike chuckled. "You think the king chose you because you work hard?" He shook his head. "There is more going on in this palace than you know." Obianoju swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Dike's smile did not reach his eyes. "If you are not careful," he said, his voice low, You will disappear like the others. Others? Obianuju felt cold. Who were the others? What happened to them? Before she could ask, Dike turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, shaking. Days passed. Obianuju tried to act normal, but her heart was never at peace. Dike's words haunted her. You will disappear like the others. What did he mean? Who was in danger? The king or her? But as the days went by, she noticed something else. The king had grown fond of her. He spoke to her softly, like a man speaking to a friend. He shared things with her that he never told anyone else. One evening, as they sat in the palace garden, he reached for her hand. Obianuju, he said, I want you to be my wife. Obianuju's heart nearly stopped. Wife? She whispered. Me? The king nodded. You are kind. You are loyal. And I know you will make a good queen. Obianuju's head spun. Her? A common maid? The queen of the kingdom? Before she could speak, she heard whispers behind her. She turned and saw Adanne and the other maids watching from a distance. Their faces were full of anger. She looked back at the king. He was smiling, waiting for her answer. She did not know what to say. That night, she returned to her room. Her mind was heavy with thoughts. Then, as she was about to lie down, she saw it. A small note. Someone had slipped it under her door. She bent down, picked it up, and opened it with shaky hands. The words were short, but they made her blood turn cold. Do not marry the king. If you do, you will die. Obianuju's fingers tightened around the note. Her whole body felt cold. Who sent this? And what did they mean? Was this a warning or a threat? The night of the engagement feast arrived. The palace was filled with music, laughter, and the sweet smell of roasted meat. Bright lanterns bright in the courtyard as the people of the kingdom celebrated. Obianuju sat beside the king, dressed in fine royal clothes, but inside she was not at peace. The warning note was still in her mind. Do not marry the king. If you do, you will die. She looked across the hall and saw Dike watching her. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. A maid walked up to them, holding a golden jug of palm wine. She bowed and poured the king's drink in a cup. Obianuju watched the liquid as it filled the cup. Something did not feel right. The king lifted the cup to drink. Something inside Obianuju screamed, "Stop him!" Without thinking, she grabbed the cup from his hand. "Wait," she said. The whole hall went silent. Everyone turned to look at her. The king frowned. "Obianuju, what is the meaning of this?" Dike suddenly stood up. "Why did you do that?" His voice was sharp. Obianuju looked down at the cup in her shaking hands. Had someone poisoned the wine? The silence in the hall was heavy. The king stared at Obianuju with confusion. "Why did you stop me?" Before she could answer, a loud voice broke the silence. "She is trying to kill the king." It was Adanne. Her voice was full of anger as she pointed at Obianuju. She grabbed the cup because it was poisoned. The crowd murmured. Guards rushed forward, their spears in hand. Dike smirked from his corner. Obianuju's heart pounded. "No," she cried. "I swear, I was only trying to save you." She turned to the king, her eyes pleading. The king opened his mouth to speak, but then his body went stiff. His eyes rolled back, and before anyone could move, he fell forward on the table. The hall exploded into chaos. People screamed. The guards ran towards the king. Obianuju froze in shock. Had she saved him, or had she just fallen into a trap? If you want to find out what happens, comment, continue the story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode.